Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning, although, again, I can't see you, but I see you with my heart, and I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're a part of our worship service today, as I'm glad to be a part of our worship service today. We are today in the middle of our series on Luke. We've been for the last several weeks looking into the life of Jesus, and as we've done that, we've witnessed the miracle of his birth with the incumbent miracle of the angels and the shepherds coming to see the child and to see the fulfillment of the promise. We saw Simeon and Anna as they were waiting in the temple at the appointed time because they knew that the Lord was going to fulfill his prophecies and his promises. We watched as the Magi visited. We watched as the rabbis were impressed by the young boy and his desire for knowledge. And we watched as Jesus grew in wisdom and stature with both men and with God. We saw him baptized to fulfill all righteousness and noted the really important question. If we truly love him, why would we not choose to be baptized when that's what he asked us to do? And so that's an important thing we noticed as we looked at it. Then we watched as he was tempted and saw the reality of temptation. You know, I often counsel with people who are really guilty feeling because they were tempted to sin. Sometimes they even react harder and maybe even more sorrowfully than those who actually gave in to the temptation. You know, I never fail to remind them that temptation in and of itself is not a sin. It's something we need to understand. Our enemy, the accuser, Satan, is always looking for a way to devour us. He's always looking for a way to destroy us. He's always looking for a way to cause us to stumble. And yet Jesus was tempted in every way, even as we are, yet without sin. That yet without sin says two things for us. Number one, it says he didn't yield to the temptation. But number two, it says that it's not a sin to be tempted. And I think there's something there we need to understand. When we're tempted, that doesn't mean we've sinned. We don't have to feel guilty for being tempted. It's when we yield to temptation that we find sin. After all these years of life preparation, we see Jesus begin his ministry. He's about 30 years old at the time of his baptism, and he begins preaching in the synagogues, as was his custom. He's there all the time. He's there preaching whenever they're having services. Jesus is there, and that's an important thing for us to see and notice about him. He was telling them that God was fulfilling his promises through Jesus himself. He was offering hope and comfort to them. He was offering ministry for the needs that they had. He was casting out demons. He was healing people. And last week we noted that he was beginning the next phase of his ministry. Last week he began to call forth followers who would go out and teach others. And these others would then go out and teach others, who would go out and teach others, who would go out and teach others, all the way down to you and I having the opportunity to hear the gospel. And how thankful I am that this one taught that one, who taught this one, who taught that one, who taught this one, who taught that one, who eventually taught my dad and taught J.L. May, so that they might teach me the gospel so that I might have hope. And I'm thankful for that, and I'm thankful that he began that ministry at that point. And this week we're going to see the beginnings of this phase of his teaching his disciples what all that means. He's going to teach them with words and with actions. And this week we're seeing one of the most important lessons they need to learn. It's found in Luke chapter 5. If you've got your Bibles handy, Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 12. I'm reading from the New King James Version. And it happened when he was in a certain city that, behold, a man who was full of leprosy saw Jesus, and he fell on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then he put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he charged him to tell no one. But go and show yourself to the priest, and make an offering for your cleansing as a testimony to them, just as Moses commanded. However, the report went around concerning him all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. So he himself often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. Here we see several things, and the first thing we notice is the cry of the leper in verse 12. It says, as he's going through there, the leper implored him. He implored him. He'd obviously heard of Jesus. He knew of the miracles. He might have heard some of the teaching, and he must have heard of some of the teaching because he has some idea who Jesus might be. He didn't have much hope in life, but he had great hope in Jesus. And the next thing we see about him, and it's almost immediate, is that he's very ill. He's very ill. You know, the text here reads that he's full of leprosy, absolutely full of leprosy. You know, this isn't some guy that's asymptomatic. This isn't some guy that might have been exposed to somebody that was sick at some point, at some time, and maybe he's sick and maybe he's not, and there's no real way to tell, and we need to do more testing. This is a guy who is sick. He has the full-blown disease. His skin is rotting. He's beginning to lose fingers and toes and etc. as the disease takes its toll on his body and as his body begins to eat away with this disease. He's beyond being able to hide it. It's not a spot here or there that he can cover up by wearing long sleeves or maybe by putting on a little mask like this. It's not something that he can hide quickly. Rather, it's something that is very, very, very prevalent in his life. He is full of leprosy, the scriptures say. And he was lonely. He couldn't help being lonely. You know, he's had no contact with anyone. He's walking around and he's covering his mouth and he's shouting, "Unclean! Unclean!" One of the first things that would happen when you had leprosy, we read about this in Leviticus chapter 13, but one of the first things that would happen is when you realized that you had a sore that wasn't healing like it was supposed to, you go to the priest, and the priest puts you through a rigmarole and a testing phase that takes a week or 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, depending on how bad your case becomes. And you're socially distanced, and you're more than socially distanced during that time. And eventually the priest announces that you are unclean. And you're required in the presence of the priest for the first time to cover your mouth and to say the words, the most horrible words you could say, "Unclean! Unclean!" I imagine he whispered it the first time. I imagine he didn't want to say the words out loud. How hard it must have been. That means no more contact with your grandchildren. It means no more contact with your wife or your children. That means not going to work next week. That means not any of the above. But people walking past you would pass by on the other side of the road, walking around and covering his mouth and shouting unclean. We live in a society today that's been challenged. Gay made me this little mask so I can go out in public and put it on like this. That's to keep me from getting sick or from getting somebody else sick. Take it back off just about as easily. The difference is, when I go home, I can take the mask off. This man had leprosy all the time. He was sick all the time. We see that he was reverent. Lord, if you will. Lord, if you're willing is another way of translating that. He wanted to ask, but he wasn't demanding help. He wasn't seeking a handout. It was a simple request that spoke very deeply of his faith and of his hope. Lord, if you are willing. And he was confident because the next words were, "You can make me well." You know, I can't count the number of times when I've seen people give up hope or doctors give up hope. When I was a chaplain at the hospital in Kentucky, it was a regular occurrence, and also in Rolla, when I was a chaplain there, we saw it many times where the doctor would say there's not anything left to do but pray. And I wonder sometimes that when there's nothing left to do but pray, why that's the last thing we come to. I've even seen Christians sometimes who are afraid to ask God for what they really want when they pray. They're afraid to ask God to heal someone. They're afraid to ask God to cause something wonderful to happen in their life. And maybe it's out of some kind of righteousness or self-idea of righteousness or something like that. But Jesus said, He promises us that we can come before God with anything in His name, whatever it is that's on our heart. As a matter of fact, we're even told that we can boldly come before the throne of God and make our requests known. But I think sometimes maybe we're just a little bit afraid What if God says no to our prayer? What if the answer is no? Or worse yet, what if we never know what the answer was and that God really heard our prayer? I think sometimes our faith is so fragile that we can't stand to ask because we can't stand the possibility that there might not be a God. And yet everywhere we look, his evidence is in front of us. He's here and he's about. Maybe sometimes we should pray, Lord, if you are willing, you can do whatever it is that we would like to have done. And then trust that God's will be done. In this case, Jesus said, I am willing. Be cleansed. The Lord's response is recorded in verse 13. It says, then he put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy, the first object lesson for his followers. He's teaching them about fishing for men. That's what we talked about last week. He said, follow me and you will catch men. They've caught fish. They understood the concept of catching fish. Now they're learning how to catch men. And catching men begins with something important here. And this is the first object lesson. Then, and it's the same object lesson we have now, he was compassionate. He reached out and touched this leper. You know, here's a guy that people turn away from. Here's a guy that they pass by on the other side of the street. Here's a guy whose family doesn't touch him. Here's a guy that doesn't get to kiss his kids goodnight or his grandchildren goodnight. Here's a guy that if you just merely bump into him on the street, you're ceremonially unclean and you've got to go through the process of going to the priest and being cleansed. And so you stay as far away from him as you can. When you see him coming down the street shouting, unclean, unclean, the street's clear for him. He doesn't have to worry about walking in a crowd. This is the guy. But Jesus reaches out and touches him. And that makes all the difference. You know, I don't think that Jesus reached out and just kind of tapped him like that with a finger or laid one hand on him and says, be clean or anything. I think Jesus reached out and grasped the man, gave him the thing he needed more than anything else in the world, the touch of another person. You know, the power of a touch is amazing. I miss a lot of things during this lockdown, but the thing I miss the most are hugs. And so I'm going to ask for a few favors real quick. Christy Williams, if you will pick up Avalee in your arms and spin her around in a circle and tell her that's for Mr. George, I'll feel better about that. And Abby Grace, if you'll pick up your little sister and hold her tight and spin her around in a circle and tell her that's for me, I'll feel good about that as well. And Emily, if you'll get hold of Elizabeth, your cousin, and hug her and spin her around in a circle and tell her how much I love her and you, and that's from me, I'll feel better about that too. And Barry Stovall, if you'll give your mom a little peck on the cheek and tell her that's from me, she'll know it really is, and I'll feel better knowing that happened. I miss those things. I miss that touch. We miss that touch. We miss those things. I can't wait to be back together. I can't wait for this separation to be over with. They say we'll never again shake hands, that we'll never again hug, and I sure hope that that's not the result of this. What I see is that more than ever we're seeing the need for one another in our lives, and we need that. So we see Jesus' words here, I am willing. Imagine how great that is to hear those words. I am willing. Whatever it is we ask of him, I am willing. I wonder sometimes we don't ask because we don't realize how willing he really is. I grew up in a congregation where we were taught constantly, it seems like, that the age of miracles ended with the death of the last apostle, and so there were no more miracles. And if there are no more miracles, why do we pray to God at all? Why do we ask him to bless our country? Why do we ask him to bless our servicemen? Why do we ask him to bless our children or to bless our families or to bless our church? Why do we ask him to be with us as we go through times of trial if we don't believe he still does things like that? And you know, if God is still in the miracle business, why don't we ask him for what we really want sometimes? Why are we afraid to go to him when we have something that we really, really have on our heart? And sometimes, again, I think is we're afraid of the no answer or of no answer at all. Maybe we're afraid that we don't have enough faith, so we just don't ask. But then we see Jesus' power. Be healed. Be cleansed. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He healed the man right then and there. The most dreaded disease known to people in the world at that time, Jesus just spoke it away. I mean, he just said the words, and immediately the leprosy was gone. The leprosy left him. That means his skin became clear. That means the sores were gone. I believe that means there were no scabs. I believe that means there was no dead skin, no hair falling out anywhere like that. It means he was healed immediately and completely, totally, and irrevocably by the word of Jesus. You know, I think sometimes we need to see these things to realize what's going on in the world and what's going on, the power that God has. No one had ever seen anything like this before. And then we see the Lord's command to the man, verses 14 and 15. He charged him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing as a testimony to them, just as Moses commanded. However, the report went out concerning him all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. You know, there's probably two reasons why he told him this go out and don't tell anybody. The first of them is that the man needed to show himself to the priest. You know, even though he was healed, it's not official until the priest confirms it. Let's go back. I mentioned Leviticus 13 and the law of the lepers. But let's look at Leviticus 14, when you're healed of leprosy, what you're supposed to do when leprosy is gone. By the way, that didn't happen very much. It says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, this is Leviticus 14, saying, This shall be the law of the leper for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the leprosy is healed in the leper, then the priest shall command to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 living and clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet, and hyssop. And the priest shall command that one of the birds be killed in an earthen vessel over running water. As for the living bird, he shall take it, the cedar wood, the scarlet, and the hyssop, dip them in the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed from the leprosy, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird loose in an open field. It continues, He who is cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, wash himself in water that he may be clean. After that he shall come into the camp, and shall stay outside his tent 7 days. But on the 7th day he shall shave all the hair off his head and his beard and his eyebrows. All his hair he shall shave off. He shall wash his clothes and wash his body in water, and he shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, 1 ewe lamb of the first year without blemish, 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a grain offering, and 1 log of oil. Then the priest who makes him clean shall present the man who is to be made clean and those things before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And then the priest shall take 1 male lamb, offer it as a trespass offering, and the log of oil, wave them as a wave offering before the Lord. Then he shall kill the lamb in the place where he kills the sin offering and burnt offering, in a holy place, as the sin offering is the priest's, so as the trespass offering is most holy. The priest shall take some of the blood of the trespass offering, and the priest shall put it on the tip of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the toe of his right foot. And the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand. Then the priest shall dip his right finger in the oil that is in the left hand, and sprinkle some of the oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord. And of the rest of the oil in his hand, the priest shall put some on the tip of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on the blood of the trespass offering. The rest of the oil that's in the priest's hand he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. Then the priest shall make sin offering to offer atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanliness. Afterward he shall kill the burnt offering. And on, and on, and on. You see, there's a process that has to be gone through. So when Jesus says go to the priest and make the appropriate offering, what he's saying is, You may be cleansed. You may be whole. You may be pure. You may be no longer sick, but it's not official until you go and take care of the things that you need to take care of, because God had set a plan in place for how to take care of these things. And I think it's important we see that, because I think sometimes we don't see the full process. I think sometimes we think, well, it's no big deal, he's healed, but there's more to it than being healed. There's more to it than just the fact that the disease is gone. Now he's got to go through the whole process of proving that he is in fact clean, because he wants to get back to his children. He wants to get back to his grandchildren. He wants to get back to his family. He wants to get back to his job, just like we would want to. And just like we don't like all of this separation and quarantine. You see, it fits in a whole lot with what we're going through right now. The second reason why Jesus told him that was probably a practical reason. You see what happens. As soon as the word gets out, the people are coming from everywhere, and now all of a sudden it's so busy around him that he can't travel for the crowds. Remember, he came to seek and save the lost. He didn't just come to heal the sick. And if all he did was heal the sick, that would be a wonderful thing that he did. But there were millions of sick people in the time of Jesus, just like there are millions of sick people today. If churches opened their doors and all they did was provide food for the needy, or provide healing for those that were sick, if they were able to provide the medical supplies they needed, if they never taught them about Jesus, they missed the most important part of the message. They missed the most important part of the mission, and he's trying to show his disciples the most important part of the mission is teaching people about the coming of the kingdom of God. And it's important that they get the message. And yet he's so tired. They crowd on him so much that he ends up having to go out to lonely places. And we see him withdraw for prayer in verse 16. He himself often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. The result of the crowds was he couldn't go anywhere for solitude. It must have been like it was back in the 60s when the Beatles came to America. I've watched the old films. I happened to see a movie a week or so ago about the Beatles when they first came to America. And it was amazing, the throngs of people that were waiting for them. Huge crowds, huge multitudes. It was almost riotous as people wanted to get close. They wanted to get a picture. They wanted to see them. They wanted to hear them. They wanted to touch them if they could. They wanted to be around them. And can you imagine, because Jesus was so much more than a rock star. So much more than a rock star. Can you imagine what it was like in those small towns? There's nowhere to hide in a small town. And they crowded around him everywhere they could. And the result was that now whenever he wanted privacy, he's got to go out into the wilderness to find privacy. Mark records that he could no longer openly enter the city, but was outside in deserted places. And they still came to him from every quarter. Mark 1 and verse 45. We're surrounded by lepers today. Sinners are just as diseased in their souls as lepers are diseased in their flesh. And they're just as in need of healing. Many of them are alone and hurting and they're abandoned. They want nothing more than to feel a healing touch. Rather than avoiding them and hiding on some kind of righteous mountain somewhere, we need to go out where they're at. We can't touch them physically or emotionally unless we are where they are. We need to care about these spiritual lepers and to reach out to them and let them know they're loved by God. Because we're supposed to be the hands and feet of Jesus going into the world. Casting Crowns recorded one of my favorite songs. It goes like this. It's crowded in worship today as she slips in, trying to fade into the faces. The girls' teasing laughter is carrying farther than they know. A traveler is far away from home. He sheds his coat and quietly sinks into the back row. The weight of their judgmental glances tells him his chances are better out on the road. And the chorus says, but if we are the body, why aren't his arms reaching? Why aren't his hands healing? Why aren't his words teaching? And if we are the body, why aren't his feet going? Why is his love not showing them there is a way? Jesus paid much too high a price for us to pick and choose who should come. But if we don't go teach and touch, we make the decision for them. That's our lesson for this morning. Our communion meditation It comes from Matthew chapter 27, verses 45 through 54. Matthew 27, verses 45 through 54. Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour there was darkness over all the land. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some of those who stood there when they heard that said, This man is calling for Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and offered it to him to drink. The rest said, Let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. So, when the centurion and those who were with him, who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly, saying, Truly, this was the Son of God.